officially live on Facebook for the B2B Community Builder Show, Season 5, 4 Secrets of High Growth Firms with Dr. Lee Frederiksen. I'm your host, Pablo Gonzalez, and Chief Executive Connector. And our guest today is a rare combination of businessman, research scientist, award-winning marketer, college professor, author, influencer, right? You speak on stages everywhere. Lee, it is an honor to have you. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
It is awesome to get into this conversation. We're going to dive into a research report that you and your firm put together about high growth firms in today's business climate, which I found really, really interesting. Before right now, I want to welcome the community that has shown up so far. Check in the chat. Let me know where you're from. I see Brett Ruiz, my good friend that I'm about to see in Cleveland in a couple of days. I see Lauren Amon, who is Amon. Lauren, I got your name right this time. That is one of my new best friends from a karaoke night at a conference that we had a little while ago. She's always supporting. Robert Rodriguez, good to have you in the house, man. I always see you on Facebook. Rowena, who set all this up. And of course, Rowan, who is in the chat. She's a community manager. If you need anything, Rowan, why don't we start with sharing the research report so people can download it in the chat as I start to pick Lee's brain about this. Lee, this report, right? Come up with basically 4 big pillars of what high growth firms are doing versus no growth firms, with the companies that are really struggling, and came up with talent retention, technology, marketing, and strategy. I want to dive into all of those. But to maybe frame what this report was all about, can you tell me what type of companies this really focused on, if you can, so we can give some context here?
Sure can. Yes. We look every year, we look at over 1,000 professional services firms of all sizes. We have segments that are just the micro firms with an individual, all the way up to the huge global international firms. And we ask the question, what are the firms that are growing the fastest and are most profitable? What are they doing differently than those that aren't doing it? And that's what we look at each year, and we follow the trends across time. And we also look at what new developments, what things happen, and how are people reacting to this rapidly changing marketplace. And that's kind of the genesis of it. Find the winners and figure out what they're doing.
I love that. It's like a Jim Collins book every single year that you get to write, right? So we did a show a couple of weeks back. It was this Harvard Business Review article that talked about how these mid-sized companies are going bankrupt at an alarming rate, and how companies that play offense seem to do better in perilous times versus the ones that are playing defense. And I guess what I'd love to ask you is, when we talk about firms, it's a pretty broad subject. Is there any kind of company that this data might not be germane to? Like, is there anything that you wouldn't, is there anybody that could be listening to this and be like, nah, this isn't really for me? Or is this pretty broad strokes across the market for companies?
I think it's actually pretty broad strokes across the market. So, if you're a manufacturer or you're into retail trade, that less so, but this is about professional services. And I would say sort of the boundary is anybody who sells expertise, or where expertise is a big part of your sale. I mean, you may sell garden cultivators, but if you're selling them through the expertise on how to be a better gardener, that's kind of relevant. So I think that's the way I think about it. How is the role of your expertise? Does that play into the sale? And if that does, it's relevant.
Love that. Okay, because I see people that we have here with us today. We got Jesse Rittenhouse. They're a green building consulting company, right? Mm-hmm. Absolutely plays into account. We got Brett, who is a design, build, kitchen and bath remodeling, one-stop shop, right? Very consultative sale. We got Lauren, who's a coach that helps professional athletes transition. We'd love to hear in the chat kind of what anybody else that I don't know your business model right off the bat, so I can add some extra context to the equation. Would love to hear about that. Out of everything that these 4 pillars that we said, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I think talent retention right now and the Great Resignation is kind of on top of everybody's minds. Yeah. Technology in a era of rapid digital transformation makes a ton of sense. marketing is not surprising to me, as I believe that everybody is becoming a marketer, right? Social media has kind of democratized marketing, and
Mhm.
strategy is one of those things that I think it's like the underrated je ne sais quoi of business. But is there any out of these categories that came out? Was there a big surprise to you out of anything, either within the category or the categories that came out themselves and the relevance? Anything kind of like shock you a little bit?
I'll tell you what surprised me. You forever we've heard about, technology and the importance of technology and the sophistication, but most of it oftentimes comes along as blah 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 blah. Yeah, and this little piece of technology is going to change everything, or that little piece of technology. What really surprised me is the strength of the relationship between the technology sophistication. How much have you really invested into that and the impact of that? In other words, if you really do put an investment into marketing and sales technology, it really does have an impact. And I mean, there's a lot of hype around that things can do. So one can be forgiven for being skeptical about whether that's true. But the fact that it was there and it was such a strong, positive relationship, that tells me that people are using technology in ways that are really helping them in very concrete, strategic ways. And I think what's happening is on one hand, they're using research and data to be able to target a fast moving environment. And we've known that for a couple of years, that research is so darn important, because otherwise you're just guessing at what's happening in this market. And once you figure that out, that you can track what's happening and you can direct your efforts in the direction that really makes sense, that gives you a tremendous amount of power to be able to do that. The other thing we're finding that is really, it's a very neat finding. Don't tell anybody, because it's a competitive advantage. Only
That's why it's secrets. That's why it's a secret.
yeah,
Yeah.
the very same research that you can use to understand where the market is going, that is so tremendously valuable to your potential clients, because they want to know, where's this thing going? Where are my competitors? What are my competitors doing? What's happening? What are the trends that are impacting? So by doing the research, you not only can gain competitive intelligence and an understanding of a rapidly changing environment, you can use that very same information as some of the best, juiciest bait you can imagine in inbound marketing.
Okay. I'm going to break down a couple of things that you said to get some clarity, right? So you
Mhm.
told me it's investment in technology. It sounds like you referenced marketing and sales technology heavily,
Mm.
and also the correlation to how well thought out the strategy is that goes into it. And then you also hit on research, which I think is really, really interesting. And I want to kind of break down each of those. So when you talk
Okay.
about the correlation between investment, are you talking about dollar amounts? Are you talking about labor hours and training? How do you quantify size of investment?
We're talking about the maturity of your marketing, your automation and marketing program. That's what we're really talking about. And that usually reflects a higher level of investment for more maturity, but not necessarily. You can have some organizations where people are self-taught and they're quite mature. So it's their ability to actually use the technology. I think that's what we're really talking about here. How do you actually bring that to bear? Because we've seen, so many organizations, they spend a bunch of money on technology, but it doesn't really do anything because they don't know how to use it and they don't really apply it. So it's just, it's beautiful technology, but it doesn't really help them very much.
Yeah.
But once you understand how you actually apply that, and you said an interesting, I did talk about marketing and sales technology, because there is a clear difference there. But there's also a difference in the technology that you use to do your business. So for example, if you're an accounting firm, you got this kind of accounting software and tax processing software. And here again, the more sophisticated you are, that actually translates into real benefit. Not surprisingly, when you're talking about great shortages in labor, that those that figure out how to leverage technology and how to use it more efficiency have an advantage. And what you're doing is you're seeing the data is starting to prove that.
Are there things that are being automated? And that makes perfect sense to me, right? Like if you can empower people through technology, then they're going to feel more productive at work. It creates a competitive advantage. And
Yeah.
we're talking about empowering from understanding how to use the tools as much as giving them the right tools to get them to execute their job well. Are you seeing are you seeing investments into like proprietary technology versus, right, like Brett, who's here with us, right? He's a design build kitchen and bath. He's building out an app to help his people estimate jobs that he's then going to license to other kitchen and bath folks like himself as a growth tool, right? A way to scale a business that is normally heavily regionalized. Is it that type of stuff that we're talking about? Is there a differentiation between that or somebody just really going hard at Salesforce and or accounting automation or any of those kinds of things? Was there any distinction between those?
That's a great question. That's a great question. The answer is when we were talking about technology and asking the questions, it's more about the use of technology as opposed to a technology product, as opposed to developing a technology product. Now, developing a technology product may be a really smart move in and of itself, but that's not exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about using the technology. And I don't want to make this sound too advanced technology where this, like one of the big things, for example, that differentiates firms that are growing fast and are successful from those that are just kind of languishing is some very old, very simple technology, just CRM. Are you actually using it or not?
Yeah. And to what level, I imagine, right?
Yeah. So some of the basic thing, when you look at which actual technologies, it's not all the just most advanced stuff that's the difference. It's actually using the stuff that's available, actually using the stuff that you already have or easily available. So I think that's the thing. So even if you don't have to be a large player, you don't have to have an artificial intelligence team to be able to benefit from technology. You just have to figure out how it helps you solve the customer's problem better.
So if I were to kind of reverse engineer from that to kind of where we started and this idea that is how well the technology fits into your strategy and how well you've invested in it, it seems like there would be some really low hanging fruit for companies that have already invested in a tool to evaluate how in line with their strategy it is, and then training people up to make sure that they are at like a high efficacy of using those tools. Is that some low hanging fruit that you've seen?
Yeah. I think that's a great example of some low-hanging fruit. A lot of firms already have the technology on board. They're just not really using it, or they don't have a strategy or plan to put it together. And we do a lot of that kind of work for firms that you think are pretty sophisticated. They have a lot of it, but they haven't figured out how this all fits together. It's historically the business development was completely apart from marketing and had no relationship, and neither of those had anything to do with technology. And like, okay, well, it's no surprise it's disjointed.
Yeah. And Jesse is saying in the chat here, that's something that he's seen with his own eyes in every sales organization he's seen. If the team was not using the CRM tool, they're not as successful as those using it, no matter which CRM tool was. That makes a lot of sense. I want to get into, we're going to nerd out on marketing on the second half of this call, because that's obviously my area of expertise and strategy and whatnot. I got a lot of deeper questions for you there. But as far as talent retention, it's becoming more and more clear to me that culture is a moat that you can build around companies, and it's a growth driver. And I'm starting to see these like patterns of companies that win best place to work awards generally win high growth awards. Can you give us a little bit of the understandings on, you already said talent was correlated to enablement of using technology. Can you give us a couple of other things that you found in the talent retention space that is working? And am I hot here on what I'm talking about with the culture thing and the alignment?
Yeah, I think you are, and we're actually doing some research on that right now about what are the specific elements of culture that really do matter and that do make a difference. I think, just given my background and what I observe in running the firm, we are living through an amazing time when there's so much best of times, worst of times, good news, bad news, this uncertainty, that uncertainty. And so I think people are really craving support. And the organization that offers them support right now, offers them flexibility to do, I think those are some of the key things you're seeing. People leave because of a bad culture. That's pretty well established fact. That's why they leave. And if they're happy with the culture, it's got to be something else that drives it, usually a lot more money or a bigger opportunity that they couldn't have had at their current one, something like that, or a family issue. But the high growth firms seem to have more talented people. They retain them. But I think one of the biggest differences that is overlooked is they also use more outside talent.
Mm.
Which is, again, not necessarily expecting it, because they already have generally better talent in-house, but they're also using them. And so they're using that as a way of leveraging those talent shortages, as a way of getting around. We don't quite have the right person and so forth. So let's get an outside help here. Let's get us over this hump. Let's learn how to do it. And then we can do it ourselves, or, keep it outside, which is a very interesting development and a very practical response to a difficult challenge.
It's interesting that that's what you found, right? In the call that my partner and I made of talking about the three things that are taking companies out, and our hypotheses was exactly that, is this idea that are you a Jim Collins nerd too? If I talk too much about Jim Collins, you're on board, right? Like the idea of being a hedgehog and specializing in the thing that you really do well, and bringing people on board for that while outsourcing other core functions. And, we have had great success doing both that, and also the idea that we're able to create a remote culture with people from all over the world. That, like, for example, Ryan, who is managing the call in the chat right now, right? Like, we have a very closely knit team with folks that start off as outside contractors that then migrate to the inside of the organization. Is that kind of what you're seeing? This idea of like another Jim Collins ping pong balls to the stuff that you're thinking about implementing by bringing in outside help that's easy to part ways with and easy to ramp up with, and then firing the cannonball and either bringing it in-house or creating a long-term partnership with that partner?
I think that's what's going on. We don't have the data yet to prove it, but that's what the pattern seems to be. It's a great way to learn something, to test out resources. I think that's what's going on.
Yeah. And we've done that. We've done a decent amount of that for a small shop. We hire partners with the complete understanding that we're going to understand what you're doing and try to implement in-house and or continue that relationship. I saw in the report what firms are outsourcing is heavily marketing functions. Do you see? Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, part of that is because that's in particular what we were looking for in marketing and strategy and growth and so forth. I'm sure if we would go to other things, if we would ask just about your technology needs or your thing, I think we're going to find the same thing, because I think they're using it as a strategy for bringing on resources that they're having a difficult time dealing with. And the difference is, here's the difference. Your high growth firms, they're figuring out, okay, here's a strategy I can use to do that. The no growth firms are saying, oh, it's so hard to get people.
Got it.
So if you start with the notion that you can't do it, you will be right.
Yeah. You find what you're looking for, right?
Well, in that regard, you do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So Brett puts in here in the Q&A, that's $1 million question, implementation, right? We're so busy that implementation of software is harder to do. For us, if it's not simplified, it is harder to get others on board. Look at Salesforce or Acculinks and CAD. So for companies like Brett's, if he is looking to do a Salesforce implementation, what would be the high growth firm playbook? Would it be to start with a partner and then maybe see if that's somebody that they can recruit in-house, train people? Is it put a point person? Are you going that deep on how they're implementing this type of stuff?
Yeah, I think the starting point would be do a small project to make sure you know what you're doing. Don't go all in right away. Incremental steps, I think it would be the high growth play. And the first part would be, which of these things do we want to take on? Which of these projects are the ones that's most likely to work for us? And then when you select the project, invest enough to do it right in the outside resources, rather than try to poke at 2 or 3 projects, not get any of them started. Pick one, finish it.
Yeah.
I think that would be the high growth play.
That's the high growth plan. Got it. So learn one thing, do it well, and then move on to the next thing, as opposed to.
I think so. Yeah. Don't take on more than you can do well.
Yeah. Seems like it makes a lot of sense, man. As far as the outsourcing that folks are doing in the marketing functions, you have website improvements as one of the highest ones that people are outsourcing. People don't feel the need to have website developers in house. You got graphic design, marketing materials development, kind of at the bottom, strategy development and research.
Mhm.
And, it seems like video production is also kind of like in that mid part. How do you explain, how would one outsource strategy? Is that even a good idea? Like, or is that intricately tied with hiring a research firm to give you some data that can then also paint some color on strategy? How does that work?
I think there are a lot of different people define strategy differently. So we have to be cautious. Whenever we're talking about strategy, I find you have to be cautious about what you're actually talking about. So I'll give you an example. We do a lot of work in branding, in positioning firms, in figuring out how they're going to go to market. That stuff is pure strategy, and it's based on an understanding of the market, gathering data, benchmarking against it, finding out what's likely to work, and then putting together a plan and a process. We have specialized skills in that. We have people that do that every day. And so, but when a company does that, you don't need to turn around and do that again next Tuesday. That's something you do, just like a website. You don't need to, yes, you have to have skills to maintain it, but you don't need to rebuild it every week. And so I think that's kind of the level with strategy, that when you understand that level of strategy, stuff you don't do. Now, if you're talking about how do you adjust your marketing plan from week to week, yeah, okay, that's a different thing. But I don't think of that so much as strategy. I think of strategy as something that doesn't change week to week or month to month. Maybe it'll change quarter to quarter, and should certainly change year to year, but you don't keep changing your strategy every week.
Speaking about that, you guys do this report every single year, right?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of strategy implementations have you seen from, I mean, we're going into year 3 of COVID, right? So have you seen any noticeable changes from, BC, before COVID, and then to COVID times, and then year 1 to year 2? Where did you see the biggest change in strategic adjustments for companies? Was it constant? Did it blip up and down? What are you seeing in that regard?
Yeah. Well, we saw with the onset of COVID, we saw a big increase in uncertainty, dealing with remote workforces, and figuring out, how do I adjust to it? And how do I adjust dealing in a environment that continues to change? And then how do I deal with a remote workforce and a labor shortage? So we've seen it sort of evolve the one step. And the thing that's interesting is how the high growth firms have sort of changed their focus each year. They're looking at, okay, what's the next problem? At first it was big. The answer that came out of the first study was research. And you saw a huge increase in the research and what they were doing there. And then you saw a big increase in dealing with a remote workforce. But you saw some of the things about dealing with uncertainty in that, they backed off again. It wasn't as much of an issue as it was the first year. So they found a problem, they took a strategy at it, they solved it, and they moved on to the next one. That I think. Now, if you contrast that to the slow growth firms, a lot of them are still at, how do I deal with uncertainty? How do I find good people? They haven't taken the action to solve any of those problems yet.
Got it. So if I'm at a firm and I haven't really found my footing since COVID, it's figure that out first and then move on to other strategies, right? It's not lessening the importance of it. It's just that the high growth firms seem to have taken on a faster learning curve in adapting to this new normal.
I think that's right. A faster learning curve. They've adjusted quickly. They've adjusted their practices and consequently got different results.
Interesting. What strategies do you see out there for dealing with unpredictability that have worked?
Basically, it is frequent adjustments. And again, the research one, it's so interesting. Certainly not all firms do it, but those that do, it's just overwhelmingly one of the most positive, impactful things they do.
So research adjustment is investing in their own research.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So tell me more about that. So I would assume that investing in your own research has multiple kind of strategic advantages. Number one is understanding where the market is going so that you can play some offense, right?
Yes.
And then two, I would assume that it's also a valuable marketing asset as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see correlation? Is the data telling you that using it for one thing versus another first, or is it the use of both together? Are there any other uses that I'm missing there? Can you tell me a little bit more about investing in and applying research as a competitive advantage?
First, to the question, is one of these more important than the other? We don't see anything in the data that shows inherently one of them is more important than the other. And it's kind of, it's like the question people used to ask before: which is better, digital marketing or traditional marketing for professional services? And the answer is both of them. When you only do one of them, you only get the benefit from one. And I think that's kind of the same thing here. You get the benefit you use, but if you only do one of it, you're only going to get part of the benefit. So I think that's where I think that's what we're going to find and where it seems to be settling in. Not just our research, but other people's independent research shows that, a research report is some of the most trusted stuff, most likely to be passed along, because people are curious about how their peers are doing. And it makes perfect sense that they would be.
Yeah, that makes sense. I literally just finished up a core story boot camp by Chet Holmes International, the company that came up with the ultimate sales machine, right? Chet Holmes, and the entire strategy was teaching how, if you can expand the breadth of what your pitch can be to be marketplace education as opposed to product and education and or transactional pitching, then you're able to move people along a buyer's journey in a very seamless way that increases the size of your market and the velocity of your pipeline, right? So I would love to hear from you as a research firm, right? If you're looking to engage a research firm, what advice would you give to somebody that's like, okay, interesting, what's my next step here? Right.
Okay, so the things you need to know about engaging a research firm, first of all, there's a lot of different kinds of research. So, make sure they do the kinds of research that you're doing. For the kinds of markets we're talking about, a consumer-oriented research company is probably just about totally worthless, or not applicable to what you're doing.
What is a consumer-oriented research company?
Which do you like, crispy or salty breakfast food?
Got it. Okay.
So that's one thing you're looking, that they have B2B experience, assuming that that's kind of what you're doing, or B2C. A second thing is that they understand something about your industry, because as it turns out, the key to making research valuable is understanding which questions to ask by understanding the context in that industry. So there aren't just good research questions that are good research questions in themselves. If you understand the context about what's happening, you can really come up with something. And that's where we've seen people we work with, what the reason they come to Hinge is because we understand the professional services and that expertise-based sale. That's the thing. We're not the largest research company. We're not the this or the that, but we understand that. So we understand the story. We understand the narrative that's happening here, and we can figure out what's the research you need to bring to bear to tell that, to illuminate that story, to give somebody insight that everybody wants to know, but no one quite figured out how to ask the question.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. It's kind of one of those things of, if you ask, if Henry Ford would have asked the American public what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? So it's at knowing what question to ask, right? It's not, do you want to get to places faster, and are you willing to invest in technology to do it? So you're basically telling me, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's the niche of the research company is really, really important, and their depth of understanding of, is it the client? Is it the supply chain? Is it the kind of business model?
The industry you're operating in,
Okay.
I think, is the best way to think of it. You can think of, imagine yourself going into an industry that you know nothing about and asking insightful questions. And like, okay, that's going to be tough.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you really understand what's happening and what the narrative is, you're going to know what are the key questions here. And I think that is the choice to finding that partner that can really help you. So you're not teaching them about your industry, they're teaching you about your industry.
Got it. So you're kind of like diversifying your access to knowledge because they've already had many touch points across competitors and peers and whatnot, right? At that point, do you typically see that a client comes with their own question to ask, or do they count on the research firm to provide them what questions should be asked, or is it a mix of both?
It varies. Some of them will come with clients, or they'll have tried it themselves. They did a survey and they got some responses, but nothing really happened with it. It wasn't very insightful. So there'll be those range of things.
Got it. That makes sense.
Any one way it happens.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit of marketing, right? One of the things that you found is that impactful techniques overlooked by no growth firms were keyword research and search engine optimization, conducting and publishing original research, right? Back to the research thing, and networking on social media. Can you tell me a little bit about how you found that and what all that means in your eyes?
Yeah. The way we do this research in marketing, we're asking several questions. We're asking about, what do you do? How much do you do of it? What's the impact you're seeing of it? And so we can then, when you have a very large number of responses, you can look across and you can see what selections, what things there are people doing, tend to be more effective at, and which differentiate those, where's the biggest difference between those that are very successful and those that aren't. And those three things, they were all right in the top few things most effective for high growth firms, all right up there, very effective. But when you look at the list of techniques, they're just not even on the list of techniques that they're using. So they either don't use them in the first place, or they tried them and they didn't go anywhere with them. And I think a lot of that is because it makes a difference how well you use a technique. All techniques don't work just by, think something we all know, networking. Do we know great networkers and do we know crappy networkers? Yes, we do. It does make a difference how you do it. And I think that is also true for basically any marketing technique. You can do a good marketing technique poorly, and it's not going to be effective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So if I'm hearing, through this correctly, then it's not just whether, it's basically that these are the three techniques that may or may not have been executed the poorest by no growth firms, which means that they gave up on it. It wasn't that they hadn't tried it. It wasn't that they didn't see it as an option. It was just they had ruled it out, and therefore it wasn't part of their game plan, even though it's one of the biggest differentiators.
That's right. Yeah. The SEO, when you think about it, think about this strategically. You're in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty, where there's a lot of roiling in the market, and you got a lot of new people entering new firms and looking for solutions and things. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to spend a lot of time searching, right? Educating themselves in the marketplace and what's available and so on and so forth. And if you're not participating in that, if they can't find you for what they're searching for, you're going to have excellent opportunities that just will never know you exist.
Yeah.
Because they just didn't happen to ask the right person. And we've seen digital marketing be so integral to success of firms for many years. Now it's just sort of caught up, so that if you're not really doing SEO, it might be bordering on marketing malpractice. I'm not sure. We'll have to
Got
see
it.
if
And
Brian Boone hauls you up.
so I think deeply about the difference between creating demand and capturing demand, right? And I've seen a lot of SEO that is basically capturing demand. And I would imagine that in professional services, where someone is looking for something that is a service that they need, they're in a buying behavior, that can create a considerable moat. But if I look at kind of the correlation of the two of the three things that you talked about, would you say that conducting and publishing original research is something that can supercharge the SEO, like the SEO, if you're also going to move into the capturing demand side part of the category?
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on something that's very important here, and that is, I think a lot of the people who don't see the role of SEO have a misunderstanding, a misperception of how it would be used. They think, oh, well, no one's going to Google defense attorney for criminal prosecution. No one's going to Google that kind of thing. And they're only thinking of the very last end unit when you already know what the service is, who you're looking for. And frankly, by the time you already know the specific service, and if all the clients know the specific service they're looking for and exactly, you're almost in commodity land. It's almost too late then. And yes, can you do business there? Yes. Is there lines of business? Is that part of a strategy for some firms? Absolutely. You can do that. You can be a commodity player. You can, capture some of this high volume, low margin stuff. But that's not really what we're talking about for the most firms. Mostly we're talking about, how do you convey your expertise? How do you convey what kind of problems you solve? How should you be thinking about this problem? And it goes back to your comment of the sales. If you're once talking about market intelligence and how you should be thinking about it and which problems you should be solving, that's when you're really getting the traction. That's where the big impact is, because you're setting you up as an authority and your expertise.
Yeah. And that takes me to the top marketing priority for firms in 2022, which to me is the best way to establish that expertise and evangelize a problem, which is creating content and social media marketing and brand differentiation, right? I see those 1, 2, 3 on there. How are you seeing the best performing firms kind of like approach that stuff?
It's interesting. I think we're starting to see a little bit of evolution. I think more people are starting to understand the role of content and the role it can play in their career advancement. So if you are in a culture, in an organization that is driven entirely by the billable hour, you're going to have that organization is going to struggle with content. If you are in an organization that is driven by expertise and being a top provider or thought leadership, and you're supported and rewarded for those kinds of things, completely different environment. And what we're finding at Hinge, for example, is a much broader a swath of people who are interested in providing content that are typically get asked to, that are willing to research things, understand something because they see how it helps their growth, their personal growth, their career growth. it becomes a point of distinction for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So
So now
I'm
you're,
starting to see a change over time.
yeah. Yeah. So you're bringing up, I want to come back to this idea of more people willing to give content than typically get asked to. But first, I want to hit on what you first mentioned. You mentioned that organization driven by the billable hour will not be incentivizing the right things, while if, or at least will not incentivize people to drive content, which we're understanding is really, really important, while organization driven by thought leadership is. And when I think of a billable hour organization, I think, well, thought leadership commands a higher billable hour, right? Like if you can differentiate yourself as the expert in your field, then you're gonna drive bigger prices and therefore drive your billable hours already, right? So is that just like a cultural mindset shift that you're seeing of this is the cherry at the top, is who can look like the biggest expert, not who can be the biggest grinder, essentially?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's true. It's sort of a redefinition. In some ways, we used to have this concept of the rainmaker. They had this big Rolodex and they would go around and bring in business. And that was the person, the relationship. Well, I think you're getting a new rainmaker. And that rainmaker is someone who can crystallize thought leadership and make it visible. And once you start to think about that, then that starts to change things.
I love where you just went. The concept of the rainmaker in my head, right? When I was in construction for 15 years, and what really bothered me was that the concept of a rainmaker was always thought of as the guy knocking on the most doors, making the most phone calls, kind of pestering the most people. And as, to be perfectly honest, as Gary Vee came into my universe, I started to think of a rainmaker very differently. It's like, who can shine the biggest beacon of light, who can create the biggest bat signal for the things that they believe in, now becomes the biggest rainmaker. And content creation and efficient distribution and strategic distribution across the social media ecosystems is what now defines the rainmaker of today.
Mm-hmm. I think to a large extent, that's what's happening. Yeah.
Interesting. Let me see. Let me see what Jesse wrote here. But I don't feel comfortable shifting content writing to an outside consultant because they do not know our business, services, and industry as well as we do. However, constantly producing content takes time away from our actual working services. Do you think having a person specializing in content writing within an organization is best, or having each person in the organization contribute for this situation when time is limited? Great question, Jesse.
Yeah, I'm not sure that either one of those is the best solution. You're right. There are some organizations that just outsource content. Here, write stuff for me. I agree. There's nothing right about that, because it has to reflect you are. What I have seen as a very successful model is where people have a writer or writers that they're using, where you can take your ideas and your thoughts and you can convey them, and the writer can interview you, and they're skilled at pulling the thoughts out and organizing. That works. Having somebody help you articulate your ideas and clarify them, that works. We know that. And I think that's probably, now some people, they get to the point where they bring those folks inside their organization where they have it, and that's fine. And some they have one or two writers that write most of it, and okay, that works. But I think you're really better if you have a little bit broader representation of what the organization is about. If you have a little bit significant understanding, depth of understanding about it. And that's where I think getting other people involved that have different perspectives and having them, I wouldn't have them just write something and send it out. You have to make sure that it accurately reflects what's important to your organization. But I do think that is a great way to get some leverage.
How do podcasts play in this strategy? And video content and like YouTube and stuff like that. Do you give that as much weight as you give written content based on the valuation of search engine optimization?
We give it the content. We're really looking at a couple of things when we're evaluating content and content types. First and foremost is the marketplace and the market's consumption patterns. Where do they look for content? There's some that are more focused on certain social media, more focused on particular kinds of things. Then we also look at the other side of it, the producer side. Where do you have a strength? I mean, my gosh, if you're very strong on audio, it's easy for you to produce. You love doing it. And even though it's not quite, your audience doesn't index quite as highly for it, that doesn't necessarily mean it might not be the right idea for you. So it's that combination of what's the audience acceptance and your ability to pull it off. And usually when you find out where they cross, that usually tells you what are the key techniques.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So, because I asked that question because I go back to the idea of, you just said it, right? There is more people in your organization that want to produce content that then get asked to produce content, right? So to me, the future rainmaker role is somebody that is able to pull content out of their ideal client and co-create content with their ideal client, be it in the written word or be it via podcasting or kind of what we do here, which is video that becomes YouTube, becomes podcast, and then we write articles about it. How much of that stuff are you seeing right now in the B2B world? And where do you think that's going?
There's a lot of it. And the repurposing I think the key advice is do a good piece of content and repurpose it in as many ways as you can. Yeah. Quality repurposed. I think that's kind of the secret, as opposed to trying to do a high volume of relatively low quality content. That no real future in that. So you have to do something that has quality to it, has an insight to it, has something that's helpful to your audience and helps them understand their business situation there and helps them understand, how do I prioritize and solve this problem? And once you're doing that, once you're educating the marketplace about that, then you're in the position to, present your strategies, your approach to that. And people want to hear it because they understand your analysis of the situation. They buy it and they say, yeah, that makes sense. Now, what would we do?
Yeah. In that regard, are you seeing people take the opportunity of content creation and the marriage of research kind of, right? Like, this is kind of what I'm doing by getting to talk to you and talking to different experts and getting a bunch of content pieces. If I can systemize a way to make good content on the front end, create a relationship with yourself, and while also educating and entertaining and, inspiring my ideal clients, but later on the compilation of all these things becomes a sort of research piece as well. Are you seeing the marriage of that stuff happening?
Yeah, I'm seeing all different variations of the sort of multi-component content strategies, where you're doing research and then you're turning it into podcasts and you're turning it into webinars and you're putting it together as an executive guide, and and then it eventually becomes a book, and all of those things make perfect sense if you start with the premise that you start with good content, you start with good analysis. Good thinking results in good results.
Yeah, go back to the strategy and the value of the strategy versus the tactic. I love that.
That's right.
Lee, where are you seeing community these days? Like, are you seeing community seep into the growth plans of firms like this, right? Like I feel like community right now is totally a buzzword, and like SaaS, as somebody that's been looking at it reticular activator style, I see it everywhere within tech firms, but from not tech firms, within service companies and firms and whatnot. For you, for the research and this constituency that you have, are you seeing that as something that they find as approachable? Do they see it as a way to learn? Do they see it as something they can execute? Can you kind of give me the state of community based on your data sample?
Well, I think one of the things we know from the research is that people trust their peers more than they trust institutions. So the extent to which you're talking about community as a peer-related community that's discussing real situations, absolutely there's some strength to that. There really is some strength. And of course, given the results of the last couple of years and the pandemic and some of the social isolation, community takes on a whole nother level of meaning, and people are working remotely, and some of the community that they had on a day in, day out basis has just vanished. So I think we're going to see a evolution or a renaissance of what happens in the community. Just don't know exactly what it looks like yet. This whole thing around your culture and your community and how they come together. We know that people are longing for something. We know they have needs, and how are they going to be solved?
Well, let's dive into that. Are you a part of any kind of like professional community? Is there any? Where are you? Let's look at it not from the tactician, but from the consumption standpoint, right? Like, are you a part of communities where you're learning? Are there people that you're seeing doing well as a service for you?
I use different kinds of communities in different ways. So I'm in a lot of relationships back and forth, educational relationships, mutual research, mutual planning about education. So that's where I get a lot of my stuff. I'm not in a lot of peer-to-peer, like agency owners, that kind of thing. I tend to be more in CEO type things. That's tend to be where I'm looking for that, because that's my role to make sure that perspective doesn't get lost in our organization, because we're doing a lot of things that directly relate to the owners of the organization. And so that's important that we continually understand how they see the world.
Got it. And is that in like a written form thing? Is that kind of like you all meet every once in a while? Are you in like a Slack channel with other CEOs, that type of thing?
No. I use a lot of techniques to accumulate information. So I'm in different kinds of relationships with different things. I don't have one where this is the thing, this is my whole thing. That's not the way I've sort of approached it.
Makes sense. Lee, what have I not asked you? Is there any, as you're advising a firm that is right now, let's say they've done okay, they have some cash flow, they're looking at the next 24 months, and let's call them a $10 to $20 million kind of company.
Mm-hmm.
What's your best piece of advice based on what you're seeing and the way to navigate the future right now that you're seeing?
I would say it is a combination of finding a way to continuously monitor the changes impacting your thing. So that, I think, has got to be number one. And whether you have your own proprietary way, whether you do research, whatever it is, find a way to monitor what's happening. And second is find a solution that you can offer to a segment of the market. Don't try to solve the whole market. Try to solve a segment of the market. And I say that because things are changing quickly. And so you could very well find yourself solving a segment problem that now becomes a mainline problem.
Interesting.
And I think that, think about Zoom when the pandemic hit. Find yourself a solution that solves something really, really well for some, and then follow that market. I think that's what I would do, because so many of these things, there's new issues coming every day. And so finding a solution and getting there ahead of folks is really, I think, when you're talking about a dynamic, rapidly changing marketplace, the advantage goes to the quick.
Man, I've never heard anybody explain it like that, right? Like I think the idea of investing in feedback and niching down has always been something that you hear a lot, but the idea that the value of it is that we are in such a rapid changing world that the small problem becomes a big problem in a really, really fast manner. And it's only a matter of time till that number's up. So you better really understand one problem really well and have the best solution for that really well as a path to growth is something that's never been explained that way. That's really interesting, man. Awesome. Wow. Yeah. You just blew my mind, Lee. I really appreciate that, man. Is there anything else? Is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you'd like to get off your chest? Anything you're hot on right now?
I'm so hot on all of this stuff that it's been a lot of fun. I've just enjoyed talking about this stuff. So I didn't hold back, buddy.
I appreciate it, man. No, you killed it. You killed it. It was great. Lee, how can people connect? What's your preferred method of connection? So we'll post, we'll link to Hinge Marketing, and who is your ideal client that you like to work with, and what's the best way to connect with you if they want to follow you on social or follow your content somewhere?
hingemarketing.com is the best way to reach me. I'm on LinkedIn, Lee Frederiksen. It's spelled a little bit funny, so be careful, but I'm pretty accessible there. In terms of ideal client, we find that it's not really so much the size of the client or the industry, it's the way the client thinks. And clients who want to be driven by research and about what works, those are the ones that we really click with.
Got it. So it's a psychographic, not a demographic that you work with, right?
Precisely.
I love that. I love that. Lee, man, I really, really appreciate you making time for this. Very, very instructional. I appreciate, the opportunity to pick your brain and you not holding back and the way that you explain stuff. I really want to thank the folks that are still with us here an hour later. Jesse, thanks for being here, man. Great questions. Mary Clunan, who's joining us from Ireland. Robert, you're still here. I appreciate that. Roanna, thank you so much for setting it all up. And I couldn't agree more with you, right? Like the idea of investing in research and investing in partners that really, really understand your pain points is something that will continue to differentiate companies. And having somebody like you so well spoken to illustrate it so clearly is a message that I really needed to hear, Lee. So I really appreciate you doing this, man.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, we'll talk soon. See ya.
Okay, great one.
Chappelle.